Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Think Your Way to an Epic Life. And I don't know about you, but I think there's a little bit of stress in the world and a little bit of lack of hope in the world. And my next guest has dedicated his entire life to helping people be able to get through that, not just get through it. And as he says, bounce, you don't bounce back, you bounce forward. My next guest, Dr. Steven Sideroff, is an expert in resiliency and in optimal performance. And his book that you can buy right now, his book really gives you hope if you're feeling like life has kind of kicked you in the teeth so many times you don't know how you're going to get back up. His book will show you the path to get to where you want to be. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to jump right in and ask you why do you have such a passion for resilience?
Well, I have a passion for life. I wake up every morning and I look forward to the day. I live in a beautiful area. I live in Topanga Canyon. So I walk out my door, I see trees and mountains and flowers all around. So it's a great way to wake up in the morning. And in my own life, my goal is to be the best version of myself, to function in the most optimal way. I do it because it's a way of enjoying life the most, but it's also a way of being the healthiest. And that translates into a model of resilience. So, resilience, in my definition, is optimal functioning. When you're functioning in the most optimal way, you're going to be the most resilient. And so all of these things tie together. And then in my work, I love helping people find the best version of themselves, because when they do that, they're going to be the healthiest and the happiest. And so I get rewarded and reinforced by people letting me know, hey, this is working. Hey, I'm feeling good. Hey, I'm no longer anxious. I'm no longer depressed. But it's also a great mystery. I'm every day when I engage with whoever I am, whether it's individuals, whether I'm at a corporation giving a talk to a group of executives, it's always a challenge because life is a mystery. And I'm trying to solve some of life's most important mysteries.
Well, it seems like you're doing it. You're not just trying. It really very impressive. So, optimum performance and resilience go hand in hand. How important do you feel that resilience is right now in this day and age more so than ever before?
You know, when we entered into the COVID era, when COVID hit, the pandemic hit, I realized that people are going to be very stressed as a result of it. It brings up uncertainty. It brings up the fear of death, the fear of illness. All of these created additional stress in people, and the people that were coming to me were feeling very stressed, very fearful. So day one of the pandemic, I started sending out daily resilience tips to my audience. And every day for an entire year, 365 days, I sent out a daily resilience tip to help people deal with what they were experiencing. And those tips help them find a positive framework to approach their day, their life, help them deal with all their emotional upsets, help them deal with the relationships in their lives. And so this has been a very stressful period of time. You know, for the first time in recorded history over the last few years, life expectancy in our country has gone down. And this is separate from COVID had an impact, but besides that, our life expectancy has gone down for the first time in recorded history. The rate of chronic illness has gone up. And, in the field of longevity, they talk about the hallmarks of aging, like the 12 biological processes that result in the aging process. Stress im- impacts all 12 of those. Stress is a major factor in the development of illnesses as well as the aging process itself, and our research shows that. So, when we focus on resilience, we're learning how to best be in the world with all of these challenges. And what I like to say, Kara, is that there's always a best way, no matter what's going on. So you say that this is a very stressful period of time, and it is, but there's always a best way to handle it, to be in it, to cope with it. And when we acknowledge that there's a best way, all of a sudden, now our thinking is going in a positive direction. Oh, let me find that best way. And so resilience is about always looking for the best way. It's having a growth mindset, a mindset that says, whatever the challenges are, I can learn to handle them better.
Absolutely. And there are people who have lived through much worse than what we're living through now. We have less hunger. We have, there's a lot in the world that is much, much, much better, yet we're so in our heads because we're not physically moving. How important is physically moving to relieve the stress?
Well, movement, exercise is very important, but I'll say that um, today we are bombarded by all kinds of media, and what media thrives on that gets attention are problems, disasters, what's wrong. Okay. And a lot of us have that approach in our lives. We start the day worrying what's going to go wrong today? What's going to be the problem today? What's going to be the difficulty today? And so I encourage people to start off the day by saying, what's going to go right today? What can I look forward to that's going right today? So we start with that mindset. But exercise is so important in our life. And one of the reasons is that we have, as a result of the evolutionary process, we have a stress response that doesn't match the stresses in our lives. So we have a stress response that mobilizes us to either fight the danger or to run from the danger. And yet, how many of the stresses in your life can you address by either of those two approaches? None, right? And so in our lives, we're continually mobilizing our bodies for fight or flight with each of the stresses in our lives, but then we have to hold in that energy. So exercise actually serves a purpose of releasing a lot of the energy that builds up as a result of the stresses in our lives. If we're thinking about a difficult encounter this afternoon, we already start mobilizing for that with the fight or flight response. And so when you pile one on top of the other, situations in our day that we're concerned about, worried about, uncertainty, all of those things activate our nervous system. And they throw the nervous system out of balance. We have two branches to our nervous system, one that activates for stress, and the opposite, the parasympathetic, that engages the recovery mechanisms in our body. And those two need to be in balance. You can't just using up resources without shifting into a state that restores. And that's where most of us have difficulties and growing difficulties because we are continually activating our stress response without giving ourselves sufficient time to recover. And it's resulted in what I've termed autonomic dysregulation syndrome. And you name an illness, you name a symptom, and it derives from that dysregulation that I just described.
What percent? Maybe 95%? I mean, isn't 5% actually really genetic?
Well, I had this wonderful conversation in one of my interviews that I did with Bruce Lipton. The environment is the most important thing.
Yes.
That you can have a propensity for an illness in your genes, but if it's the stresses in our lives that determine whether genes become expressed or not. And so most of our illnesses are the result of stress, the result of the burden that we place on our bodies, and that's what triggers any genetic vulnerability.
Right. So, okay. So let's say we have a police officer, a frontline military person, an ER doc, somebody who constantly has that stress turned on, and they get something very wrong with them, whatever it is, a tumor, whatever, and they come to you for advice. Where do you start with someone that has that much built up in them?
Yeah, and a lot of people like that do come to see me, and a lot of people probably in your audience are under the burden of some kind of physical symptom or another. A lot of stresses in their lives, and again, we start by saying there's always a best way. We start by saying, let's get grounded. Let's find the foundation. Let's get a starting point. Okay, so this is another issue that we all experience, which is a feeling of overwhelm by all that we're dealing with. And that's why I created in my book the notion of the path. So the path is here alongside of you all the time. And all you have to do is, and I talk about this in my book, take a few steps that put you on the path based on my model of resilience, my 9 pillars of resilience. So if you just take a few steps to put yourself on the path, you're doing all that you can do. And it's important to appreciate, okay, I'm on the path now. If I'm on the path, I'm heading in the right direction. And it helps address this sense of overwhelm we feel like there's so many things I need to be doing, I should be doing. We can't do all of those things. But if we put the pressure that we should be doing all these things, what actually winds up happening is we give up and don't do anything, right? And so this notion of the path is something that's here right alongside you. You could take a few steps that put you on the path, and now you know that today you achieved success. So for those police officers, frontline people that come in, I begin by having them accept where they are. Okay, here's where you're at. You can't be any place other than this. Let's start by accepting that. Next, let's begin to address the imbalance that all the stresses in your life is causing. So that would be beginning some form of relaxation, meditation practice on a daily basis. And that's the first step. The first step is, we're sending the nervous system up in this direction all the time. Let's do something that reverses that brings you down that continuum. So that's the first step. The second is a growth mindset. And a growth mindset is that whatever is difficult right now, we can learn better ways of dealing with it. So the foundation is some form of relaxation. The next is mindset. And then the third key is dealing with your emotions, dealing with upsets, and and finding ways to address the feelings that you're carrying, because life is triggering our feelings all the time. And if we ignore those feelings, they go underground and then they impact us in a more toxic way. So we need to be aware of our feelings. We need to address and deal with them so that we can let them go and not build up this excess baggage that we might carry around with us. So that's how I begin my work with people in those three areas. And then the next step is to look at our pattern, look at our old pattern from childhood, lessons of childhood that we carry into our adult life, because we learn how to be in the world based on our childhood environment, based on those lessons of childhood, but they're not necessarily the best lessons. For example, we learn to be hard on ourselves, we learn to be critical, we learn to be judgmental. We learn and we get the message we're not okay. So these are all negative messages that we carry in our core, because those are early survival lessons that need to be noticed and then addressed. No, these are not healthy lessons. We have to stop listening to those lessons, and we have to find healthier lessons to live by. So it's a relearning process. As I said earlier, it's a growth mindset. And we have, one of my goals in working with people is for them to simply be open to say that the way that they are treating themselves is not correct. If I'm putting myself down, that doesn't support me. That is not a healthy way of being. That's not being resilient. You want to come from, you want an internal voice that comes from a place of love, compassion, and acceptance, not criticism and judgment. So that in and of itself is a learning process. And that's a key learning process of shifting where you ground yourself from the old messages to newer and healthier messages. And that's a key part of my model of resilience. The first pillar is our relationship with ourselves. And we want that to be a healthy relationship.
And I'm aware of Carol Dweck's work, the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset. For our listeners that aren't aware of that, what is the difference? Can you give us like examples? This is what someone would do who has fixed mindset. This is someone who has a growth mindset.
Yeah, a lot of people will come in and to work with me, and they'll feel hopeless. And they'll feel hopeless because I'm an anxious person, and they see themselves as an anxious person, and how that runs their day, runs their life. And so they're coming from this fixed mindset that if I'm an anxious person, I'm always going to be an anxious person. That's just who I am.
That's my identity. Don't mess with my identity.
And that's what you just said is an important point, because some people are locked into a lot of negativity as their identity and who they are. And so it's important first to let people know this is not in your DNA. This is all learned. And anything that's been learned can be unlearned as long as you have a better model to work toward achieving. And so a growth mindset says that there's certain lessons that you learned that are underpinning your anxiety. And so, a lot of people that I work with anxiety had a parent who was anxious, had a parent who approached the world from this place of fear. And the child is not discriminating. The child is not sit back and say, well, is that a good way to be in the world? No. we as children, we assume that that's the way to be. We assume that that's the way to approach situations in your life, from a place of, I don't know if I'll be able to do it, from a place of people are going to judge me, from a place of I'm going to get it wrong, from a place of if I'm not perfect, then I shouldn't try it at all. All of these are childhood messages, lessons that we get that can contribute, for example, to anxiety. And so we begin to open up to maybe it's possible with a growth mindset that you could learn different ways of being. And then we're on, and once the person I'm working with is open to that as a possibility, now we're on the right path. So a growth mindset looks at a shortcoming not as a permanent shortcoming, but as an area to put a focus on to learn how to grow and get better at whatever the shortcoming is. And so a growth mindset is a mindset in which you feel like what happens in the world are challenges rather than just problems. And challenges are something to rise to the occasion, not only so that you can handle it, but because every time you do, you grow from the process.
So by the time you guys see this, you can go buy this book. And I highly recommend that you do. So, Dr. Sideroff, how do you feel about energy healing?
So there are many ways of interpreting energy. And the way I like to, one of the ways that we interfere with the energy and flow in our bodies is by holding in our feelings. Most of us are learn that maybe it's not okay to be angry. It's not okay to cry. And, growing up, if we're angry at a parent, that could be very dangerous because our survival depends on our mother and father. And so our survival depends on the bond we have with our parents. So if we start to feel angry at them, that could be very threatening. And so a lot of the feelings that come up in childhood, we're not able to fully acknowledge and express, and many of them get turned back onto ourselves. And what happens when we turn that back on ourselves, we literally have to physically hold those emotions in. And when we hold those emotions in, we interfere with the flow of energy in our body. And I believe that much of depression, and this has been my experience, much of depression is the depressing of other feelings. And so we are limiting the flow of energy in our bodies. And so we don't only have depression, but we are unable to experience joy because joy requires the flow of energy in the body. And so I believe a, a, a lot about how energy flows in our body and how a lot of the lessons of childhood result in the constriction of that energy.
Okay, so if someone has that, how do they release it?
So a lot of times people, even when they recognize, hey, I'm angry at my father, I'm angry at my spouse, um, they're reticent to address those feelings because they're afraid if they express anger, that the other person is going to get even more angry, or the other person is going to reject them, or is going to be upset with them expressing the feeling. What's important to realize with our feelings is our feelings are ours and our responsibility. And we actually don't need the other person to address our feelings. In fact, we may have unfinished emotional business feelings with people who are no longer in our lives and perhaps people who are dead. but we still have to address those feelings. So what I like to have people do is I'll have them imagine the person that they're feeling, say, angry toward, sitting right with them in the room with us. And I will have them express their feelings right in the room. Because what needs to be finished is the awareness of the feeling and the expression of the feeling so that that energy moves through the body, and then you could let it go. If you try and say, okay, I'm not going to be angry at so and so without doing the appropriate work, it won't happen. And I do have a lot of people coming in to work with me that say, yeah, I was angry, but I'm not angry anymore. And it's baloney. They just pushed it down. And when they realize, so I say, okay, humor me. Imagine this person here and just express your anger. And when they do, they go, oh, yeah, it's still there. And they recognize it. But they had to begin that process of expressing before they would acknowledge and recognize, yeah, I'm still sitting on some of that anger. So it's important to express it. But the key ingredient in really letting go of a feeling that you have towards somebody is the recognition that you don't have any control over them. You can't make them be a certain way. You can't even make them listen to you if they're not available to listen to you. So there needs to be a certain acceptance that's key in expressing the feelings in order to let them go. And that acceptance is, this person may never give me what I need. It's not up to me. They may not even be capable of giving me what I need. And so there's that acceptance, because if you express the feeling, and this happens a lot, but you're still wanting something from the other person that they're not willing or able to give you, you're going to keep generating new feelings of anger and frustration. So in conjunction with expressing a feeling to get it out and let go of it, there needs to be an acceptance that I can't control the other person. They may never give me what I need. That's an important piece here, because if we don't let go of that person hoping that they meet our needs, we will always have difficulty getting those needs met from people who may be more capable of meeting those needs. We need to let go here to be available to get those needs met over here from someone who's actually capable of meeting those needs.
Wow. It is, I really believe that I could talk to you for 8 hours and it would all be great content that this has been your passion. How did all this begin for you?
Well, I've always wanted to know where and how learning and memory takes place in the brain. So for me, the foundation of human behavior is learning and memory. How and where does that happen? So I started out in brain research, but then I realized I wanted I wanted to be able to ask my subjects, what are you feeling? And I was working with animals, and you can't ask the animals that. You can ask, but you're not going to get very good answers. And so I moved into clinical. And what I love about the work that I do is that it's always a challenge and it's always a mystery. Like, someone's coming to me with the pieces of a puzzle, and we have to find a way to put them together and create healing and create growth. Healing and growth. And so that's a very exciting process for me. Recently I was working with a group of executives, and there was a whole other level of challenge because of their responsibility in the world to hundreds and thousands of people. And so I'm always faced with different challenges to to figure out how people can become the best version of themselves, how people can overcome their wounding, people can overcome the ceilings that were placed over them in childhood and break through those ceilings. And it's all a tremendous challenge.
It's very cool. So I would love, and obviously you don't need to say the person's name, but I would love one of your favorite. I know you probably have hundreds of favorite stories of someone who came in and they were at this level and now their life is just wonderful. But who comes to mind when I ask you that?
I worked with a very well known singer who was not working because of emotional issues and stress. And I worked with her for a number of months in a combination of therapy and neurofeedback. Neurofeedback is where you monitor brainwave patterns and you literally train a person to shift their brainwave patterns. So a lot of a lot of people that come in with trauma have too much very low frequency activity, but also too much high frequency activity. So the low frequency creates like cognitive fog, and the high frequency creates anxiety and tension. And this person had both of those. So the neurofeedback down trained those two frequency bands and then up trained frequencies that support more focus, concentration, but also calmness. And after a few months, that person was back out performing. So it wasn't all me, but I think what I did contributed to the turnaround in her life. And I work with a lot of people who are coming to me because their lives are not working. And sometimes, like another case, another person came to me, and this gentleman was a CEO, but the stress was getting to him. And he started to have different kinds of physical symptoms. He was not able to sleep well at all. And so he was fatigued a lot. And all of these things create a snowball effect. Once there's some kind of breakdown, then it affects the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And you become even less capable of handling stress. And so we went through a process that I've described earlier in terms of foundational work, getting to a place where he can calm his body through practicing relaxation and doing biofeedback that I did with him. That gave him a little bit of a sense of confidence. His sleep started to improve. We worked on his sleep. So a lot of people, when they have difficulty with sleep, feel very anxious at bedtime because they're going to sleep worried about whether they're going to be able to fall asleep. That worry actually makes it more difficult to fall asleep because that worry creates the activation of their nervous system. So I reframed bedtime and sleep and talked about coming down this continuum of activation rather than, okay, how am I going to get from being awake to being asleep? That's, wow, what a chasm that is to get from there to there. Instead, we looked at it as a continuum that we will train you to improve your ability to come down this continuum so that when he went to sleep, rather than worrying, am I going to be able to fall asleep? Now it shifted to, okay, all I have to do is start coming down this continuum, much more doable. So he didn't have the anxiety because he was going to bed and doing something that he was now capable of doing. And gradually he got better and better until he began to fall asleep more readily and stay asleep. But the staying asleep also involved cognitive work where he went to sleep and he worried about stuff from work. And so that was a retraining process. If I if I go to sleep and I use bedtime to problem solve, use bedtime to start thinking about all of the problems in my life, that's a behavioral problem. It's a conditioning, it's a habit. Okay, that's the simplest way of framing it. I have this habit. When I get into bed, I start thinking, right? So we developed a process of shifting from thinking, which activates the left side of the brain, to something that activates the right side of the brain. And that is focusing on how my head feels on the pillow. It's about sensation and feeling. So it was a retraining. Every time went to his thinking, no, bedtime is for sleeping only. And now we shift to how my head feels sinking into the pillow. And we focus on feeling and sensation. And 5 minutes later, he'll catch himself thinking again, but he does the same thing and shifts back. So it's a retraining process. And we can identify so many of these kinds of habit patterns that we've been engaged in that we just keep doing because they're habits. And now it's time, if you want to become more resilient, to start identifying healthy habits that we shift from these unhealthy to these healthy habits. And, the whole notion about resilience, people talk about resilience as bouncing back, the ability to bounce back. You've heard that, right? Right. So that's wrong. That's wrong. You don't want to bounce back to where you started from. When you engage in a stressful experience, when you engage in a challenge, when you engage in any kind of experience in life that is a challenge to you, you want to learn the lessons of that challenge. So at the end, you're actually further along than when you started. And I refer to this as bouncing forward. So in life, you want to be bouncing forward.
Brilliant. I love that. And I love the picture, the visual of that, because it's very true. You do. So before we let you leave, and we appreciate your time so much for sharing with all of our listeners, do you have any last words of advice, any podcasts, books, or anything that you would recommend other than, of course, your own, which I'm highly recommending to everyone. Even though I haven't read it yet, I will.
Well, the important things are that you realize that wherever you are, however you're stuck, you can learn ways of doing it better. You can grow from your experience. What it takes is the courage to engage in the challenge. It's like my ninth my ninth pillar is power, the ability to get things done. And for that to happen, you have to raise your courage above your fear of action. And so it's always about finding the best way. It's always about a positive mindset. I lay out my 9 pillars of resilience in my book, and then I've identified what I mentioned earlier as the path, so that at any one time a person can ask themselves, am I on or off the path? And if I'm off the path, the book gives some very simple steps to get back onto the path. So this is something that can really make a difference in people's life, in feeling more hopeful rather than defeated in their life. That's one of my goals in writing my book. Number one is not just to give information, but to do it in a way that people actually follow through. And then the other is for people to read it and have hope that they don't have to continue being overwhelmed by all the stresses in their lives, As long as each day you take a couple of steps that put you on the path, you're golden. And so it's a positive approach that anybody listening can take and work and become more resilient.
Thank you, doctor. That was fabulous. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
I did too. Thanks.